I want to clear these points up before I get into the video. Yes, the font needs to be changed. Yes, it needs to come onto consoles. And yes, this game should have got the HD 2D treatment. So without further ado, let's get into the video. What is up guys, Jen here bringing you another video, and before we get into it, I just want to state that this game was provided by Square Enix, though it doesn't influence any of the words that I say in the video. That being said, you've probably noticed that the Final Fantasy VII intro is playing, and this plays into the title of the video that I've given, and it plays into kind of how we're going to enter this review, and that is Final Fantasy VII is my favourite Final Fantasy game of all time. It's my favourite game of all time, and that's not going to change, and that's just due to kind of the way I was introduced to it. Again, it was my first Final Fantasy, and it kind of opened my eyes to all these different games we could play, because I was mostly platformers when I was a young child, but Final Fantasy VII opened the door to kind of these massive worlds, storytelling, character building, making you care about characters, the music, the way you had to think for battles, and I could go on and on and on, but you guys know what Final Fantasy brings to the table, so that will always be with me. And when I get asked what's my favourite Final Fantasy, it will be Final Fantasy VII. But when it comes to the best Final Fantasy, a lot of people say 6, and this video is kind of supporting that because I agree, and that is why the title of the video is "This is the best, but it's not my favourite." So I want to take you back again. Obviously, Final Fantasy VII was my first. I went on to 8, 9, and then 10 came out. And around the same time 10 came out, I believe here in the UK we got Final Fantasy VI that came with a Final Fantasy X demo disc, or it might have been a video disc, and we got Final Fantasy Anthology, which it contained 4 and 5. Obviously, being a Final Fantasy fan and going forward with the franchise, I wanted to go back and see what it was all about and how it got built up over time. So I got these games at the same time as Final Fantasy X, so you can imagine that it did get to the back burner for quite a while, but I did venture into Final Fantasy VI, and I've got to admit, I had a tough time getting into it. It was a little bit more difficult than what I was used to. It was a little bit more challenging. I didn't really kind of get invested in it because of the going back to a pixel-based game is very hard to do, and it's hard to accept that like this is better than what you've kind of used to. And I think I played about half of way through it. I played to the stage where the world changes and you know things get a bit drastic and the real stuff happens. So flash forward to here and now with the Pixel Remasters, and as we've seen with the previous Pixel Remasters, these are the most definitive versions. A lot of people will say with the earlier ones, the PSP Anniversary Editions are the best, the advanced versions are the best. With 6 particular, people like the original SNES version, but for me, the Pixel Remaster is the definitive edition. And I'll go into why, because you are getting the most closest experience to the original Final Fantasy VI, and now that I'm older, I have that tolerance to kind of go into the game, accept it, and kind of embrace these things that I didn't when I was at a younger age. And that is with the world building. The storytelling is amazing in Final Fantasy VI. It's above and beyond anything that I've played. It will not take that favourite Final Fantasy spot because of just that nostalgic tie to 7, but I do agree that this is an amazing world that they've built, and the story in itself and the characters and the optional content that was within this Final Fantasy. This was like the Final Fantasy that introduced like things that you could miss, like really legitimately miss, from summons to characters to little story segments and interactions. Playing this Pixel Remaster, I got to kind of get that firsthand, and I'm thoroughly enjoying that experience. Now, I think that's enough what I want to talk about with gameplay, because it's as tight as you'd expect a Final Fantasy game would be. When it comes to the story, again, it's one of the best stories in Final Fantasy history, with the greatest cast of characters. So I want to talk about the Pixel Remaster itself and what it brings to the table in its kind of enhancements. Obviously, it's nice to have it on like a widescreen. I do think the colours are a little bit bright for Final Fantasy VI, because the original Final Fantasy VI had a bit of a darker tone to it. With this colour palette kind of matching the previous Pixel Remasters, I can understand from that perspective. But when it comes to kind of the aesthetic of Final Fantasy VI, it kind of takes away from it, because it is supposed to be kind of a bit of a darker, grungier tone, especially when you get deeper into the story and the things that it entails. You want that kind of color palette to match. Now, on the flip side of that is the music, and this remastering, this kind of reorchestrated version of Final Fantasy VI soundtrack is insane. Now, obviously I've not played all the way through the game, but I definitely gave the soundtrack a listen, and that's one thing I like about the Pixel Remasters, is the option to listen to these old tracks, well, these new tracks of old tracks. And I've sat on hours and end while I've just been doing things on the computer listening to this soundtrack. It is amazing, and it definitely suits the Pixel Remaster. I literally don't have a bad word to say about the soundtrack, unless we're talking about the opera house scene. That in itself, when it comes to the Pixel Remaster, we're getting a bit of a preview of the HD 2D, which I do think Square eventually will do a HD 2D remake of 6 with voice acting. I think we'll get it. But back to the opera scene, the voices, the singing, even though it's in multi-languages, and I can respect that, it's a bit, when it compared to the rest of the soundtrack, it's a bit iffy. But after looking at interviews and kind of stories on this, they wanted to go for an aesthetic of like, these are characters that are not used to singing in an opera, and I get that. But when you're listening to this epic soundtrack and you kind of listen to obviously that's an extreme exaggeration of what it sounds like. Don't worry, it doesn't sound like that. You can see where I'm coming from. It kind of like when you get this epic soundtrack, and then I get they're supposed to be normal people, but you'd want to put a bit more emotion in it. But it's better than I can sing, so let me put it that way. When it comes to just the Pixel Remasters itself as well, obviously I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the font. If it's going to consoles, we don't have the option to change that. Obviously you can see in the footage that I've changed it to the OG Final Fantasy VI font, so I'm hoping that if it does get that console port, that maybe we can get those fonts fixed, or at least give us the option to choose between. Really don't know why it's not been addressed, like why the font is like this, because it's probably the most common question they got, and they choose to ignore it, and I don't understand why. And when you look down to it, it's a simple switch of changing the EN font with the JP font, and then you get the font how it's supposed to. So it's really weird to me why it's never been addressed officially by Square Enix. But I'm going a bit off the rails now. We want to move back into the topic at hand and why Final Fantasy VI is the best. I really think it's a Final Fantasy you've got to experience for yourself, and I'm hoping that my words during this video has kind of enticed you, maybe just a little bit, to try it. You can pick it up on Steam. I highly suggest you do. It is one of the best Final Fantasies. You can pick it up as the 1 to 6 bundle if you really want to kind of look at Final Fantasy past. These Pixel Remasters as a whole, and I guess I can kind of top the review as looking at the Pixel Remasters as a whole. It's a great homage to the Final Fantasy series, and I'm glad that these are as close to the originals as they can be, with a new lick of paint, not so great fonts, but kick-ass music and just faithful to the original. And Final Fantasy VI is the icing on the cake. I do hope it gets its console port. I do hope that Final Fantasy VI doesn't get forgotten about after this entry, and that we may see something HD 2D down the line. But the Pixel Remaster is definitely a game you want to pick up, play and experience, and see why people say this is the best Final Fantasy, because Final Fantasy VII I've touted this many times, is considered to be the best Final Fantasy until you play Final Fantasy VI. So give it a go. Let me know what you think, guys. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I thank you guys for listening to the video. If you've enjoyed yourself, please hit the thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button. And until next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.